I was very pleased to hear Apollonian Germ talk about Sabbateanism, Frankism, the lodge system, European nobility, and the relationship of those things to revolutionary liberalism. Because if we are the counter-revolution, broadly speaking, if we are, despite our backgrounds coming from a secular perspective, or a European pagan perspective, or Christian perspective, we are all united in opposing these forces. On our side of the fence, we are revolutionaries against the revolution, as a certain notorious political figure of mid-20th century Central Europe said of himself and his people. So regardless of these perspectives that we come from, we're the revolutionaries standing against the revolution. We're the counter-revolutionaries. And so if this is the case, we need to understand what the revolution is and where it comes from. What's its background? What's it made up of? And so it's that stuff that I just listed. Now, I translated a book by Katz and Scholem, and this book provided a bunch of the information that Apollonian Germ mentioned in his talk that he gave. It was the source for a lot of this information. It wasn't translated into English before I did that, and I got a very good response from people. I don't know how many copies of that book I've sold, but I still sell a copy every now and then. I might sell one every 2 weeks or one a week or something like that. And I only make $5 or $6 off of each of those books when I sell one. So I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, making money off that. But it is nice to know that people appreciate that and they're interested in it. So I thank you guys for having bought a copy of that book, because I know a lot of you guys have. Let's talk about Kabbala and its relationship to Sabbatean Frankism. The Kabbala is a Talmudic evolution of Babylonian magic and Babylonian mystery religion. We know this because if you read the Old Testament, it is absolutely 100% opposed to magic, sorcery, and witchcraft. However, once you get to the Talmud is in favor of certain magical practices, the creation of certain amulets, and mystical knowledge as expressed in sorcery and various other magical practices. There's Babylonian oil magic and there's amulet making. These are both approved in the Talmud. And so it's almost certain in scholarly books and articles that I've looked at, you can look at too if you look this stuff up, there is evidence that this Kabbalistic magical tradition comes directly out of Babylon. Some people have created big theories about the influence of Babylon, and essentially saying that the struggle between good and evil is a struggle between this Babylonian religion and the forces of good, however you define those. I'm not going to get into any of that, and I don't find it particularly interesting, but it does seem to me pretty clear that Kabbala is an influence on the Israelite religion through contact with Near Eastern mysticism and occultism coming out of Babylon a very, very long time ago. And so it's not really hokey or silly or ridiculous to claim that some of these things have really, really old antecedents. Antecedents that by any other stretch of the imagination would seem really far-flung and really historically quite remote. Now, Kabbala, as we understand it today, really crystallized somewhere around, let's say, 1100 or 1200. So it's present in the Talmud, but you can't find it in its modern expression until 1100 or 1200. The Zohar is the main text of this thing, the first and primary text, although it's endlessly, expanded upon afterwards. The Zohar was supposed to be discovered and to actually be really ancient, but of course they almost certainly wrote it, around the time when it appeared. It came out in Spain, and it was almost exclusively a Sephardic, what we would understand as a Sephardic phenomenon. So this would be southern France, I think, is one of the hot spots, Spain, and also modern-day Palestine. And so the main guys who created Kabbala were Jews who were active in these areas. Their family was from. This is where they traveled back and forwards to. And basically from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple up to, I don't know, let's say the year 13 or 1400, this Jewish occultism and mysticism and the Kabbala more generally were not European phenomenons, because Jews were not European. Jews, wherever they existed during this time period, were essentially living in little islands in Europe, but they were totally outside of the European world in these little islands. They were living in these exclaves, you might call them, that even though they were physically present in Europe, they were so isolated that they weren't really a part of European life, and they weren't part of European civilization, essentially. They interacted with it, but they weren't a part of it. Now, that changes around about the year 1400. The Protestant Reformation and the shift of certain currents in Eastern mysticism as a result of the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, these were two forces that caused the development of so-called Christian Kabbala. Now, these things are contradictions in terms. There can be no such thing as Christian Kabbala, because just like Old Testament religion, like Israelite religion, Christianity is completely opposed to witchcraft and occultism. Nevertheless, there are people who self-identify as Christians who are mystics and occultists and are interested in this material and inject it into their worldview and their studies. And they came up with essentially alchemy, I guess you could say, although that term is really complicated and loaded. But what they were trying to do, I guess we'll have to back up for just a second. Part of the idea behind Kabbala, well, let's back up even further. Talmudism is the idea that the genius of the rabbis can improve upon the Old Testament and can expand the writ of the Old Testament. So what the rabbis do is they use reason and casuistry and sophism and legalism to develop and circumvent and supersede the law of the Old Testament. Okay? And so once you've done that, you're sort of on a Luciferian track anyway, because you're saying that you can improve upon God, that you can do better than God. And people have pulled various quotes out of the Talmud where it's pretty obvious that this is the mindset that's going on. So if I say that my reason is greater than God's reason, or if let's tone it back a little bit, and we'll say that it's not any individual rabbi that has a reason that is greater than the reason of God, but the rabbis as a corporate body have a reason greater than God. Well, if I inject mysticism in this, and I say that magic and sorcery are real and possible, and you can learn them and you can implement them, well, now you can control God, because you have the possibility, perhaps by yourself or corporately, to do better reason than God. And now you can implement these magical practices. You put those together. Now you can force God to do certain things. Okay? So that's sort of the practice of Kabbala. Now, then the idea comes out of this, well, if you have the power to do better than God and to control God, this means that God is not perfect. God is not all-knowing. God is not all-powerful. So if God is imperfect and not all-powerful, this means he's incomplete, and therefore you can fix God and you can fix his creation, the world. So this is where you get tikkun olam and all this other kind of stuff. This is what you get out of it. Now, this notion then fuses with currents that have been in Christianity since the very beginning. This is the Gnostic, dualistic mindset. If God is imperfect and his creation is imperfect, you can use sorcery, mysticism, and magical stuff to fix God and fix the world and create the utopia on earth, rather than live in an evil, sinful, broken world and then meet God in the afterlife where everything's going to be perfect and pure. So you can see how this historical thought develops over time through these different influences, some of which in the form of Gnosticism are just perennial and recurrent in Christianity, and then the other ones that come specifically out of Judaism and Talmudism and Judaic Kabbala. Okay, so around about the year 1400, you get the emergence of Kabbala into Europe. So previously I made the claim that to the extent that Kabbala and Jews and Judaism and such were present physically in Europe, they were outside of European civilization and they were doing their own thing even though they were inside Europe. That starts to break down in the 15th century, and you can look at E. Michael Jones and the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, his chapters in the book on that. Or you can look at Michael Hoffman's book, The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome. And then there's a whole big literature. I think Frances Yates might be one of them, an important one, where she talks about the Italians of the Renaissance studying this so-called Hermetic philosophy or Hermeticism. And these were occult, mystical texts that purport to have great antiquity, and they're occult and they're mystical, and they're promoting these notions outside of Christianity that talk about the nature of the world and existence. And essentially, you're using your reason and your gnosis to reach a true understanding that's something greater than just the revelation that you can find in the texts of the Christian and Jewish world. Okay, so that takes place, and also the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant movement, they start working closely with rabbis to try to come up with Christian interpretations of the Christian Bible that will allow them to break the hold of the Church of Rome. And I'm sure a lot of them, they were coming from a good place because of secular abuses in the Catholic hierarchy. There were problems there. I don't think anyone would say that there weren't problems. But what they do when they study with the rabbis is that they come up with Talmudic, Judaic ideas, and to that extent, Protestantism has to be considered a Judaizing theology because it is closer to Judaism than it is to Catholicism. As a reaction, if you're climbing a mountain or something, you've got to have like a foothold by which to propel yourself up. And what they did was they used rabbinical methods of exegesis and homiletics to try to develop a position from which they could, react against the Catholic Church. I'm not sure if I'm running out of space on this thing, so I'm gonna pause this, and I'm gonna go run an errand, and then I'm gonna come back and we're gonna pick it up, talking about the developments that come out of Rome and 1500s. I'll be right back. Okay, it's been a very long day since we were on that car ride together, but we're going to try to pick this up where we left off as best I can. I'm outside right now at, God knows, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, so that I don't wake up my child. Now, in this thing called the Renaissance, there was if it wasn't all necessarily good, there certainly was a flowering of new ideas and new spins on old ideas. And what took place, like I think I talked about, was this injection of Hermeticism and Kabbala into Christian minds, into the civilization of Christian Western Europe, which hadn't really existed before. And so from, we'll say, 1400 or 1450 up to, I don't know, let's say 1700, something like that, this stuff begins to permeate throughout Western civilization and through European culture, just at the top, because these are the only people who have leisure time and who have access to education and who have high levels of literacy and who have enough money to pay for this stuff. But apparently it was in great vogue, and even if this stuff was garbage, even if it was shit, for lack of a better word, there was a huge trade in magical texts, grimoires, and just occult paraphernalia. And so if you follow somebody like Styx Hexenhammer, you would know that he, at least was back when I used to follow him. I don't anymore. I found it to be kind of insipid politically, so I stopped following him. But you would know that these people in our era who are into occult literature and occult texts, they're mostly consuming stuff that was created during this era. So sometime between the year 1500 and 1700, occultism really gets entrenched in Western Europe, and they create a whole lot of material indigenous to Western Europe, but it's all just riffing on this stuff that's coming out of the East and the Near East, and a lot of it through Judaism. Now, like I'm pretty sure I said before, Gnosticism, as part of the Christian tradition, the Gnostic heresies of Christianity, have always been there since the first, and they did appear in Europe before this time. But the specifically Kabbalistic stuff, that's new, and that's when everything really got supercharged and went off the rails. And most, I think, of what you would encounter in Western esotericism and occultism dates more or less to this time. That's when it starts to enter Europe and evolve. And so now we're going to talk about the fruits of this. And it comes through in two people that we can talk about. And one of them is a guy with a really long name, but we'll just call him Martinez de Pasquale. And Pasquale came from a family of converso Jews from Spain. Now, a converso is a Jew who has legitimately converted to Catholicism, generally, but they still maintain some sort of ethnic solidarity despite their religious conversion. Now, what this would point towards, in my opinion, is the idea that Judaism is not simply a religion, but an ethnic affiliation, and probably has some significant biological roots. And that just because you change the religion, you don't change the culture. And so, anyhow, in Spain and Portugal and these other places, when these Jews would convert, they would still maintain a strong community. And so there was a whole lot of conflict between elite Spaniards and elite Portuguese and these conversos, because when they came into European civilization, when they came into Catholicism in these places, they continued to behave as though they were a coherent ethnic group, and that put the native elite Spaniards at a disadvantage in trying to gain positions and prominence and compete against them in trade and other things. So that's conversos, and that's distinct from Marranos, which are crypto-Jews. Okay, a converso is actually a Catholic or whatever, and a Marrano is still a Jew. So Martinez de Pasquale, his family were at least conversos, possibly Marranos, and they moved from Spain to France. And because they were so rich, like a lot of these conversos were, they were given a special dispensation to form lodges. And so Martinez de Pasquale inherited this from his father,
and he used it to form a mystical esoteric lodge. And Freemasonry has not always been as Kabbalistic and evil, more or less, apparently as evil and Kabbalistic as it later became, because Martinez de Pasquale was able to come up with the prototype of the Kabbalistic lodge that I think would later become the standard, or it would serve as this huge gravitational force that would pull all of the other non-Kabbalistic lodges toward itself. So even if all Masonic lodges didn't become Kabbalistic, they were drawn to become more so through this important force. And so Martinez de Pasquale did not start a system called Martinism, but the later people who came and developed his stuff further created Martinism. And I think there were 2 or 3 people that came after him before it was consolidated. But so he creates this esoteric Kabbalistic lodge system that's very popular. That I think was in about 1750 or 60. And then 20 years later, we get Moses de Brusca, the Frankist Sabbatean. And this is the guy that Germ Scholem wrote the book about. This is the book that I translated, talks about him. And so what he did was, with 2 or 3 other people, he formed the Asiatic Brethren. And this was very similar to what de Pasquale did, except for the fact that it was overtly political, and it actively sought to establish itself as a super lodge in order to draw away the best members from the existing lodge system in Central Europe. And I think Apollonian Germ said that the Asiatic Brethren was an Illuminati lodge, and I'm not sure about that. I don't think it was Illuminati in a formal sense, but what it did was it functioned exactly like we imagine the Illuminati to have functioned. So eventually the Asiatic Brethren and this type of Kabbalistic political lodge was more or less banned, and these people were kicked out of these various places. And so there was a big battle, I think, in Germany in this time between these lodges that were the traditional ones, and I guess more or less Christian, and this new kind that was advocating revolutionary liberalism and mysticism and magic and sorcery. And so when I was translating this book and reading about this stuff, it was very interesting for me to see that there was actually a distinction between these things, and that this idea of Illuminism, I guess, right, for lack of a better word, even though it goes by a different name, that this was appearing in different places at the same time, and that it was viewed by the majority of these Central European Masons as a pernicious and evil force. Okay, and so Jacob Frank, he dies, and then de Brusca has the option of becoming the leader of the Frankist cult, and he decides that he would rather go to France and be part of the revolution. And I think he went to Strasbourg and messed around there and almost got his head cut off, and then he went to Paris, where he did get his head cut off after getting into even more capers. Not the vegetable product, but the scams and frauds. He and a bunch of the other Jacobins had their heads cut off for defrauding the state. And you'll notice that these guys quite often get involved in financial schemes, and there's no coincidence there, right? Okay, and so that's where the mainstream story about Sabbatean Frankism more or less ends. It ends around 1800 because Jacob Frank dies. His successor doesn't materialize, and so Jacob Frank's daughter runs the cult for another 20 years or something, and then she dies, and then the whole thing goes into terminal decline, and then they more or less disappear. And the most that we hear about them is the fact that a whole bunch of really important Jews in America who are from Central Europe end up being members of Frankist families. And the mainstream historians would tell you that this, again, is just a historical coincidence and it's not a big deal. Don't pay too much attention to it. There's nothing to learn here. And so Brandeis, I think, is the most famous one. And so there's a bunch of influential Jews who were involved in the Democratic Party in America and the legal system and the FDR administration, and then the teens and 20s who were into all this stuff. So that's the Sabbatean Frankist connection. And so you can just go nuts with it, all the connections to international high finance and Rothschilds and communism, Bolshevism, and everything. You can just go nuts because it's all there, more or less. What we don't have are the key points that connect all these people to these ideas, but they're basically all in a room together hanging out. As Joe Segura says, they would all be on the couch, doing whatever to each other before they go back out into the public space and pretend like they're all independent and not related. Now, Marvin Antelman, who was a rabbi, he went through his theological training in America. He was an American Jew. And then once he got out doing his own thing, he started to butt heads with some of the people in the American rabbinical establishment. And I can't remember the specific problems and complaints that he had, but I know that he had a big court case against them. And as a result of this, he wrote his book called Eliminate the Opiate, which I have to thank the fallen soldier Rick Miracle, who's like quadruple or quintuple banned on YouTube at this point. Because even though Rick Miracle didn't give us a lot of really, novel analysis of these books he would talk about, he would go through this enormous bibliography and just expose all these different books that I'd never heard of. So he's how I came across this book, Eliminate the Opiate. And so what Antelman did in that book was he gave us a theory of what happened to the Sabbatean Frankists after the year 1800. And, of course, there was this big controversy over Emden and Ibeschutz, and I won't get into that because Apollonian and Germ talked about that at length. But what Antelman said was that the core of the Sabbatean Frankists went to America, and this would have been the families that Brandeis and other people were part of. And in America, they took over, or established and then took over, just established the two main branches of Judaism in America, Reform and Conservative. And so Antelman spends quite a bit of time talking about the Rabbi Stephen Wise. And if you've read much about the history of World War I or the interwar period or World War II, then you've come across Rabbi Stephen Wise. He was a big player, and he was the most important Jew in America, or at least the most important public speaker for Judaism in America during that time period. Well, Marvin Antelman claims that Stephen Wise was a Frankist, and his evidence for that is this woman who was a journalist wrote a book, and what she had done, I can't remember her name, but maybe we can look it up. It wouldn't be too difficult to find out. But she wrote a book in which, once she was an old woman, she wrote a book explaining all of the adventures that she had had as a journalist. And one of the ways that she was very successful as a journalist is she would have sex with all of the men that she was covering for her stories. And so Stephen Wise was one of these men, this rabbi, most prominent rabbi in America. And what she said was that he, more or less raped her, more or less, kind of. And he made certain statements. I think after that they had actual, what would you say? They had non-controversial sex, let me put it that way. And during one of these sexual encounters, he made a certain statement, a certain citation from the Old Testament. And Marvin Antelman says that people who know about these matters, this was definitely something that the Sabbatean Frankists would say during their sex acts. And Apollonian Germ talked about the kind of stuff that they were into, but basically it's anything that's a transgression they view as good, because the evil acts are pushing this evil world towards an Armageddon that will result in something better. I don't know. Well, I'm not going to get into any of that, but you can read about it yourself or listen to him talk about it. But they basically think that the more evil they commit, the better it is. So this is the theory, according to Antelman, that conservative and Reformed Judaism are essentially dominated by Sabbatean Frankists, and that these are their intellectual and political projects. And I'm pretty sure he identified as Orthodox, Antelman did, and therefore he is, striking out at these things which he thinks are perversions of Judaism. And maybe I said it before, and maybe I didn't, but you can look at Europe, and then you can look at Judaism and Jewry, Orthodox Talmudic Judaism, and reach your own opinion about those two things. But we know that the way that things worked for us and for the Jews in the Middle Ages was very different than how it works today. We know that during the Middle Ages, the Jews practiced usury, and they undermined some of the religious morals of the Christian European communities. But at the same time, they were also subject to expropriation and expulsion, whereas today this is not even possible. So the power dynamic has shifted due to novel practices, and I guess the big thing to draw out of this is that revolutionary liberalism and the establishment of modern liberal states along Freemasonic lines has institutionalized Jewish power in a way that has never happened before in the history of European civilization. And so this is a fruitful area for research for us, because all of these things are joined together in the study of Sabbatean Frankism and its activities in the lodges around the year 1800, because we're living not even so much under the liberal system of the French Revolution. That's the public face of the world that we live in. But we know actually that there are secret societies with occult, mystical worldviews that are ruling behind their mask of liberalism. So maybe it comes from this. Okay, thank you for your time, and we'll talk again soon.